The air in the solicitor's office was as thin and brittle as old parchment. It smelled of dust and sealed-away lives, a mausoleum for promises broken and bargains struck in quiet desperation. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the relentless gray drizzle that wept down the panes, blurring the London street into a watercolor of misery. He did not want to be here. He wanted to be anywhere else. On a battlefield where the rules were simpler, in the House of Lords where the combat was at least honest in its treachery, or even back at his sterile, silent London residence. Anywhere but here, presiding over the final, distasteful act of a duty he had long since come to resent. He felt the solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, shift his weight, a nervous rustle of papers that grated on Alistair's already frayed nerves. The man was a vulture in a well-tailored suit, picking over the bones of other men's misfortunes. Today, the carrion was the Vance family, or what was left of it, a bankrupt merchant, a desperate uncle, and a niece to be sold. Alistair's jaw tightened. He had agreed to this arrangement for one reason and one reason only, the continuation of his line. His title, his legacy, demanded an heir. It did not demand affection or companionship or even civility. It demanded a womb, and this pale, quiet girl was apparently the vessel his advisors had deemed most suitable, well-born enough to avoid scandal, destitute enough to ask no questions. He turned from the window, his gaze sweeping over the tableau. The uncle, a man whose face was a roadmap of weak choices and weaker whiskey, was sweating despite the chill. And beside him, the girl, Alara Vance. He had not truly looked at her before. In his mind, she was a name on a document, a solution to a problem. Now, seeing her, he felt a flicker of something. Not pity, never pity, but a cold, detached assessment. She was slender to the point of seeming fragile. A gust of wind might snap her in two. Her dress was clean but threadbare, the dark wool a stark contrast to the unnerving pallor of her skin. She was not looking at him, or at her uncle, or at the solicitor. Her gaze was directed at her own hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She was utterly still, a porcelain doll waiting to be placed on a shelf. "Your Grace," Abernathy began, his voice slick with false deference. "All is in order. The marriage articles are prepared. Upon your signature, Miss Vance's dowry, or rather, the settlement of her family's debts, will be executed, and she will legally become the Duchess of Blackwood." Alistair moved to the heavy mahogany desk. He picked up the pen, its nib scratching against the silence as he affixed his signature. Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood. The name felt like a brand, a weight he carried every moment of every day. He did not look at her as he signed. He was signing away a portion of his fortune to settle a drunkard's debts, and in return, he was acquiring a wife he had no intention of knowing. It was a clean transaction. He preferred it that way. "It is done," he said, his voice flat. He pushed the document across the desk. Alara did not move. It was her uncle who nudged her, a sharp, insistent prod to her ribs. "Sign, girl, sign." For the first time, she lifted her head. Her eyes, he noticed with a remote sort of surprise, were not the dull brown he had imagined. They were a startling, lucid gray, the color of a winter sky just before a storm. In their depths, he saw not fear, not desperation, but something cold and hard and utterly unreadable. It was a flicker of defiance, quickly extinguished, but he had seen it. She took the pen, her hand surprisingly steady, and signed her name. Alara Vance. The ink was a stark black stain on the page, the final word in the story of her old life. A faint, dry cough escaped her lips, a small, bird-like sound she tried to suppress into the collar of her dress. It was the only sign of the weakness her uncle had so eagerly pointed out during the negotiations. A delicate constitution, he had called it, as if it were a selling point. To Alistair, it was merely another inconvenience. He had stipulated she be sent to Blackwood Manor, his remote northern estate. It was a place of exile, a crumbling pile of stone he had not visited in a decade. It was, he had been told, a place where things went to be forgotten. A dying bloodline, a decaying house, a sickly bride. It seemed fitting. My carriage is waiting, Alastair stated, not to her, but to the room at large. He had business in Westminster. He had a war to fund and a government to manipulate. He did not have time for this. She will be conveyed to Blackwood Manor tomorrow. He turned to leave. The matter concluded. Your Grace. The uncle stammered, scrambling to his feet. Will you not escort her? To your home. Alastair paused at the door, his hand on the cold brass knob. He turned his head just enough to pin the man with a look of pure, undiluted disdain. I have purchased your niece, sir, not courted her. She is now my responsibility. A responsibility I will discharge as I see fit. Do not presume to instruct me. He looked past the man, his eyes briefly meeting Hilaire's. Be ready in the morning, he commanded. It was not a request. Then he was gone, leaving behind the scent of cold rain and the suffocating finality of a life sold and a future condemned. Hilare sat perfectly still long after the heavy oak door clicked shut, severing her from the world she had known. The solicitor was already tidying the papers, his movements brisk and efficient, as if clearing away the debris of a minor unpleasantness. Her uncle was breathing heavily, a wheezing sound of relief. He had saved himself. The cost was incidental. The cost was her. She felt nothing. It was a strange, hollow sensation, as if she were watching this scene from a great distance, a ghost already haunting the edges of her own life. The cough returned, a dry rattle in her chest, and this time she did not bother to hide it. The air in the room felt thick, unbreathable, and for a moment, the world tilted on its axis. She tightened her hands in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She would not faint. She would not give them the satisfaction. She had spent her life as a dependent, a burden, a poor relation with a persistent cough and an inconvenient intelligence. She had learned to survive in the margins, to be quiet, to be observant, to expect nothing. She did not expect kindness from the Duke of Blackwood. She did not expect affection. The look in his eyes had been clearer than any contract. He saw her as a duty, a piece of property, a necessary evil. He was sending her to a remote estate to produce an heir and, she suspected, to conveniently expire. His final words to her uncle confirmed it. A responsibility I will discharge as I see fit. A strange, cold clarity settled over her. She was a commodity. Very well. Commodities did not have feelings. They did not have hopes. They did not need to be liked. They only needed to endure. She had been enduring her entire life. This was just a different kind of prison, a grander cage. As her uncle finally rose, his hand hovering uncertainly near her shoulder before retreating, she looked up at him. The lucid gray of her eyes was no longer unreadable. It was glacial. I trust my things will be packed, she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the stale air. It was the first time she had spoken in over an hour. Her uncle blinked, taken aback by her tone. Yes, of course, Hilare. Everything will be seen to. She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. She was no longer a porcelain doll. She was a shard of ice. Good, she said, walking toward the door without a backward glance at the man who had just sold her. I have a long journey ahead of me. The journey north was a silent, jolting penance. Hilare sat alone in the Duke's carriage, the leather seats cold and unyielding against her back. The relentless rain of London had followed them, a constant, drumming companion that blurred the passing countryside into a smear of gray and sodden green. The carriage was opulent, emblazoned with a crest she did not recognize, but inside it felt like a coffin. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old leather and something else, something metallic and cold, like the lingering ghost of the Duke's presence. He was not here, but his absence was a palpable force, a chilling reminder of the man who now owned her. For 2 days, she stared out the window, watching England dissolve. The neat, manicured fields of the south gave way to rolling hills, then to rugged, wind-swept moorland. The sky grew larger, more oppressive. The stone walls that lined the roads were darker, slick with moss and rain. This was his land, the land of the Duke of Blackwood. It felt ancient and unforgiving, a place that did not suffer weakness gladly. The cough in her chest seemed to deepen with every mile, the damp air seeping into her bones, a cold promise of what was to come. On the evening of the second day, the carriage turned off the main road and onto a rutted track that seemed to lead into the very heart of the brooding landscape. The trees grew thicker here, their branches clawing at the carriage roof like skeletal fingers. A pervasive smell of decay rose from the damp earth, a scent of wet leaves and rich, black soil. It was the smell of things left to rot. Finally, through the deepening twilight and the ceaseless drizzle, she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not a house. It was a geological feature, a jagged outcrop of dark stone that seemed to have been thrust up from the earth in a fit of violence. It crouched on a low hill, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the desolate moors. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, choked the walls, its dark leaves plastered against the stone by the rain. Several of the chimneys were dark, no smoke rising to soften their stark silhouettes against the bruised, purple sky. The estate was not just neglected, it was actively dying. It was a tomb. The carriage shuddered to a halt on a gravel drive that was more mud than stone. The door was wrenched open by a footman whose livery was as damp and frayed as the mood. No one came out of the house to greet her. The great oak door remained shut. Alara gathered the thin wool of her cloak around her and stepped out, her worn leather boots sinking immediately into the cold, grasping mud. The rain was merciless, plastering her hair to her scalp in seconds. She stood alone, a small, solitary figure in the vast, intimidating shadow of her new home. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the front door creaked open, spilling a weak, flickering light onto the wet stone steps. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine that seemed to absorb what little light there was. Her face, when Alara could finally see it, was a mask of pinched disapproval. "The Duchess, I presume," the woman said, her voice as sharp and cold as the wind. There was no welcome in it, only a weary resignation. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper." Alara inclined her head, refusing to let the woman see her shiver. "Mrs. Gable." The housekeeper's eyes flickered over Alara's damp, travel-worn figure, lingering on the mud staining the hem of her dress. The assessment was swift and dismissive. His Grace sent word you were to be expected. The pause was deliberate, laden with meaning. Expected but not wanted. "Come inside. You are letting the damp in." Alara stepped over the threshold, and the cold of the house hit her like a physical blow. If the outside had been dying, the inside was already dead. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and cold ash. A vast, cavernous hall rose up into shadows, its stone flags slick with moisture. Furniture huddled under dust sheets like a collection of pale ghosts. The only source of light was a single candelabra held by the housekeeper, its flames guttering in the drafts that snaked from every conceivable direction. "His Grace is not with you," Mrs. Gable stated, her eyes narrowed. It was not a question. "His Grace has duties in London," Alara replied, her voice steady despite the chill that was sinking deep into her bones. "Of course," the housekeeper said, a thin, humorless smile touching her lips. "He always has duties elsewhere." She turned, her black dress rustling like dry leaves. "Your rooms are this way. We have prepared the east wing." She led Alara up a grand, sweeping staircase, the unlit portraits on the walls watching them pass with blank, dusty eyes. The air grew colder with every step. The east wing, it turned out, was a long, desolate corridor where the drafts seemed to congregate for a party. Mrs. Gable pushed open a heavy door, revealing a bedchamber of monumental proportions and glacial temperature. A vast, curtained bed stood like a mausoleum in the center of the room. A fire had been laid in the grate, but it was not lit. "Your things will be brought up," Mrs. Gable announced, placing the candelabra on a small table. "Supper is at 8. Do not be late." She did not ask if Alara was hungry or tired. She simply stated the rules of the house. This house. Her house. Alara walked towards the towering window, her hand tracing the condensation on the cold glass. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine mist, shrouding the moors in an impenetrable gray veil. She was utterly, completely alone, abandoned in a rotting house with a hostile staff and a husband who had sent her here to be forgotten. The cough that had been her quiet companion on the journey returned with a vengeance, a deep, racking spasm that left her breathless and leaning against the window frame for support. He had told her uncle he would discharge his responsibility as he saw fit. She understood now. He had not just brought her to Blackwood Manor. He had banished her to it. He had brought her here to die. A cold, hard knot of anger began to form in the pit of her stomach, a small, hot coal in the overwhelming chill. He expected her to fade away quietly, another ghost to haunt these damp, decaying halls. She pushed herself upright, her spine straight. She looked at her faint reflection in the dark glass, a pale, determined ghost. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she whispered to the absent Duke, her voice a raw thread of sound in the crushing silence. "But I have no intention of dying, quietly or otherwise." The first week was a descent into a cold, damp hell. The East Wing bedchamber was a perfect instrument of torture, designed to nurture her cough into a full-blown inflammation of the lungs. The drafts were relentless, insidious serpents of cold air that slithered under the door and through the ill-fitting window frames. The vast, canopied bed was a tundra of frigid linens, and the fire, when it was lit by a sullen housemaid each evening, seemed only to push the chill into the corners of the room, where it lurked with a malevolent patience. Mrs. Gable ruled the house with an iron fist and a perpetually sour expression, her presence a constant, silent judgment. The rest of the staff were phantoms, flitting through the corridors with downcast eyes, their loyalty clearly belonging to the housekeeper who had been there for decades, not the new, unwanted duchess who had been there for days. Alara felt her strength seeping away, draining into the damp stone of the house itself. She spent her days confined to the room, her meals brought on a tray and left just inside the door. The food was bland, lukewarm, and served with a kind of grudging reluctance. She was a prisoner, and this room was her cell. The cough became her constant companion, a rattling chain that bound her to the bed. She would lie for hours, staring up at the water stains on the ceiling, which spread like dark, ominous maps of unknown continents. She was losing. The house was winning. The Duke was getting his wish. She was drifting in a feverish haze, caught between waking and sleeping, when the thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was a memory, a fragment of her father's voice from long ago. He had been a merchant, a man who understood the cold, hard logic of profit and loss. Never fight a battle on your enemy's terms, Alara. Find your own ground. Her enemy was this house, this room, this cold, and she was fighting it on its own terms, allowing it to sap her will, to drain her life away. She sat up, the movement sending a wave of dizziness through her. Her breath hitched, and a fit of coughing shook her frame, but this time it felt different. It was not a sound of weakness. It was a sound of rage. White-hot clarity burned through the feverish fog. She was Alara Vance, now the Duchess of Blackwood. This was her house. It did not belong to the ghosts of the past, or to a hostile housekeeper, or to an absent husband who wanted her dead. It was hers. She threw back the cold, heavy blankets and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet met the icy floorboards, and a shock of cold ran up her spine, but it was invigorating, not debilitating. She stood, swaying for a moment, her nightdress hanging limply on her thin frame. She looked around the vast, gloomy chamber. It was a tomb, and she was done being buried alive. She walked to the bell pull and gave it a sharp, decisive tug. She waited. Minutes passed. The silence of the house pressed in. She pulled it again, harder this time, a furious, insistent summons. Finally, the door opened and a young housemaid, no more than 16, peered in, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise. "You are to move my things," Alara said, her voice raspy but firm. The maid blinked. "Move them, Your Grace." "To where?" Alara pointed a trembling but determined finger. "Out of this wing. Out of this mausoleum. Find me a smaller room. A warmer room. One with a fireplace that draws and a window that shuts. I do not care how small it is. I do not care if it is a servant's room. Move me. Now." The girl stared, dumbfounded. Then she scurried away, presumably to fetch Mrs. Gable. Alara did not wait. She began to dress, her fingers clumsy but resolute. She would not spend another night in this room. She was no longer a dying woman. She was a living one, and she was about to start acting like it. Mrs. Gable arrived, her face a thundercloud of indignation. "Your Grace, what is the meaning of this? The East Wing has always been prepared for the family." "The East Wing is uninhabitable," Alara stated, turning to face the housekeeper. She was fully dressed now, her worn wool dress a suit of armor. "It is damp, it is cold, and it is making me ill. I will not stay here." "His Grace gave no instructions for you to be moved," Mrs. Gable said, her voice rigid. "His Grace is not here," Alara countered, her gray eyes locking with the housekeeper's. "I am, and I am the Duchess of this house. You will find me a suitable room, or I will find one myself. I assure you, you will not like the one I choose." For a long moment, the two women stood in silent opposition. A battle of wills waged in the frigid air of the bedchamber. Alara did not waver. She held the housekeeper's gaze, her own burning with a feverish intensity that had nothing to do with illness. Mrs. Gable was the first to look away. A flicker of something, begrudging respect, perhaps, or simply surprise, crossed her face before the mask of disapproval settled back into place. "Very well, Your Grace," she said, her tone clipped. "There is a small suite of rooms in the south-facing wing. They were the former governess's quarters. They are modest. They are warm." Alara asked. "They are smaller, easier to heat." "Then they will be perfect," Alara declared. "Have my things moved immediately." The governess's suite was a revelation. It consisted of a small sitting room and an even smaller bedroom, but the windows faced south, catching the pale, watery sunlight for a few hours each day. The fireplace was small and efficient, and when a fire was lit, the room became a cocoon of warmth. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, Alara felt she could breathe. The move was a declaration of war, and she had won the first battle. From the sanctuary of her new rooms, she began her campaign. She was still weak, but the warmth and the small victory had ignited a spark within her. She requested the estate ledgers. Mrs. Gable resisted, claiming they were the Duke's private business. "I am the Duke's wife," Alara had replied calmly, sipping a cup of hot, herbal tea a kitchen maid had brought her. "His business is my business, especially when his business is allowing this estate to crumble into ruin around my ears. Bring me the ledgers." The ledgers arrived, a dusty, leather-bound stack of neglect. They smelled of mildew and old paper. Alara spent days poring over them, her sharp mind, honed by years of making her father's household account stretch, quickly cutting through the tangle of mismanagement. The estate was bleeding money. The home farm was barely producing enough to feed the staff. Rents from tenant farmers were years in arrears. Vast sums were being spent to maintain wings of the house that were entirely unused, inhabited only by spiders and damp. Her first order was to close off the entire north and east wings. "Board them up," she told a stunned-looking handyman. "We are not heating rooms for ghosts." Next, she summoned the groundsman, a grizzled, weather-beaten man named Mr. Thorne. Unlike the indoor staff, he seemed less in thrall to Mrs. Gable. He met her gaze directly, his own eyes a shrewd, intelligent blue. "The home farm," she began, a ledger open on the small table in front of her. "It produces almost nothing." Thorne nodded, his expression grim. "The soil is tired, Your Grace, and we've no funds for proper seed or to repair the drainage ditches. And the kitchen gardens? A grimace. Overgrown. We grow what we can, but—" Alara looked at him, a plan forming in her mind. "Mr. Thorne, I want you to turn over every square inch of the formal gardens. The roses, the ornamental hedges, all of it. We will plant vegetables. Potatoes, cabbages, carrots. Things that will grow in this soil. Things that will feed us through the winter. The groundsman stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. The formal gardens? Your Grace, they were laid out by the 5th Duke's wife. They are famous. They are famous, and they are useless, Heir said flatly. We cannot eat roses. I need food. This house needs food. Can you do it? A slow smile spread across Mr. Thorne's weathered face. It was the first genuine smile she had seen at Blackwood. Your Grace, I can do that. It would be my pleasure to put a spade through those ridiculous French knots. That was the beginning of the true shift. Thorne became her ally, her lieutenant. He saw the pragmatism in her orders, the sheer, bloody-minded sense of them. Through him, she learned about the estate. She learned which tenant farmers were struggling and which were lazy. She learned which parts of the roof were leaking the worst, which fields were waterlogged, and which of the estate's assets, a stand of old oaks, a collection of forgotten silver in the vault, could be sold for timber and coin. She worked relentlessly. She rose at dawn, her days filled with a dizzying array of tasks. She drafted new, fairer rental agreements for the tenants who were willing to work. She authorized the sale of the useless, tarnished silver, using the funds to buy seed, 2 new milk cows, and a flock of hardy northern sheep. She oversaw Thorne's progress in the gardens, her own hands, once pale and soft, becoming stained with dirt as she helped to plant rows of seedlings. She learned the names of the staff, not just the maids and footmen, but the stable hands and the dairymaids. She discovered that the sullen housemaid who had lit her fire was named Sarah and had a talent for baking, and promptly moved her to the kitchens. The house began to change. The pervasive scent of mildew was slowly replaced by the smells of baking bread, wood smoke, and drying herbs. The core of the house, the kitchens, the servants' hall, her own small suite, and a handful of other necessary rooms, became an island of warmth and life in the sea of cold, dark stone. The shutters on the closed-off wings were a visible symbol of her practical rule. She was not trying to restore the manor to its former glory. She was turning a tomb into a fortress, a functional, defensible home built for survival, not for show. The staff's loyalty, once firmly with the absent Duke and his proxy, Mrs. Gable, began to shift. They saw a duchess who was not afraid of dirt, who understood accounts, who cared more about a full larder than a polished ballroom floor. They saw a woman who was fighting for the survival of the house, and by extension, for them. They began to bring their problems to her, not the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable watched this transfer of power with a silent, simmering resentment, but she was powerless to stop it. Heir had not usurped her authority. She had simply made it irrelevant. One crisp autumn afternoon, Heir stood on the terrace, looking out over her new kingdom. The ridiculous French knots were gone, replaced by neat, thriving rows of vegetables. In the distance, she could see the new flock of sheep grazing on a hillside. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the tenant farms, a sign of life and warmth. The air was cold and clean, and when she breathed it in, her lungs did not protest. The cough was gone, a ghost of a memory. She was still slender, still pale, but she was no longer fragile. She was strong. Forged in the cold and damp of this place, she had been reborn. She had arrived as a prisoner, a sacrificial lamb, but she had refused to be sacrificed. She had taken the ruins she had been given and had built a world from them. Her world. This house, this land, it was hers now, claimed not by law or title, but by sheer will, by sweat, and by an intimate understanding of its every stone and every blade of grass. She heard a footstep behind her and turned to see Mr. Thorne, his cap in his hands. "Your Grace," he said, a note of something akin to awe in his voice. "The first of the potatoes are ready for harvest." Heir smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her lucid gray eyes. "Excellent, Mr. Thorne," she said, pulling on a pair of worn gardening gloves. "Then let us begin." She had been sent here to die. Instead, she had learned how to live, and she had forgotten all about the Duke of Blackwood. Alastair rode north with a weariness that had settled deep in his bones. The session in Parliament had been brutal, a bloody war of words and veiled threats that had achieved little and cost him much. The political landscape was a fetid swamp, and he was tired of wading through it. He was tired of London, of the endless obligations, the sycophants, the schemers. He was tired of the weight of his own name. He felt hollowed out, an empty vessel filled only with duty and exhaustion. For 6 months, he had not thought of his wife. Or rather, he had actively avoided thinking of her. She was a problem solved, a loose end tied up and sent away. He had dispatched her to Blackwood Manor, the great, crumbling mausoleum of his family's past, and had expected nature to take its course. He had received no letters, no pleas for help, no word of any kind. He had assumed, with a cold, dispassionate logic, that this silence meant one of two things. Either she was managing to survive in quiet irrelevance, or she had succumbed to the house and her own frail health. He had not, until now, particularly cared which it was. In his more cynical moments, he had almost hoped for a black-edged letter. It would have been cleaner. But now, fleeing London, he found himself inexplicably drawn north. He was not seeking a wife. He was seeking a grave. He craved the silence, the desolation of Blackwood. He wanted to be enveloped by its cold, its decay. He wanted a place where he could be left utterly alone, a place as hollow and empty as he felt. He imagined the rotting grandeur, the damp, the silence. He expected ruins. He craved them. The first sign that something was amiss came when he was still 5 miles from the manor. He passed a tenant farm, one he remembered as being on the verge of collapse, its fences broken, its fields fallow. Now, the fences were mended, and a curl of healthy white smoke rose from the chimney. A small flock of sheep, their coats thick and clean, grazed on the hillside. Alastair slowed his horse, a frown creasing his brow. It was a flicker of life in a landscape he had consigned to death. He dismissed it as an anomaly. But the anomalies continued. The old stone bridge over the river, which had been crumbling for years, had been repaired with sturdy, new timbers. The ruts in the main track leading to the house had been filled with gravel, making for a smoother ride. As he drew closer, he saw that the trellis along the drive had been thinned, the dead branches cut away, allowing more light to filter through. It was tidy. The word felt alien in the context of Blackwood. He rounded the final bend in the drive and pulled his horse to a dead stop. He stared. He did not recognize the place. The choking ivy had been cut back from the windows and walls, revealing the clean, strong lines of the dark stone beneath. The gravel on the drive was fresh, raked smooth. And from 4 the main chimneys, plumes of smoke rose into the crisp autumn air, not the thin, pathetic wisps he remembered, but thick, confident pillars of white against the blue sky. The house was not crouching in the shadows. It was standing tall, breathing. It was alive. Alastair felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had taken a wrong turn and arrived at someone else's home. This was not the tomb he had been seeking. This was something else entirely. He dismounted, his boots making a satisfying crunch on the gravel, a sound he had never heard here before. He walked towards the great oak door, a feeling of unease settling over him. He had expected to be the master returning to his neglected domain. Instead, he felt like an intruder. The door opened before he reached it. A young footman, his livery clean and well-mended, stood there. The boy's eyes widened in recognition, but there was no fear in them, only a polite surprise. "Your Grace," he said with a slight bow. "We were not expecting you." "Evidently," Alastair said, his voice tight. He stepped inside. The change was even more jarring. The great hall was no longer a cavern of damp and shadows. The air was clean, smelling of beeswax and wood smoke. The floor was swept, the dust sheets were gone, and a massive fire roared in the great hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the stone walls. It was warm. Blackwood Manor was warm. He stood in the center of the hall, turning slowly, trying to process the transformation. It was not the Blackwood of his memory, nor the ruin he had anticipated. It was smaller, somehow, more compact. Then he realized why. The grand archways leading to the north and east wings had been boarded up with raw, unpainted timber. It was a brutal, pragmatic act, an amputation. Someone had cut away the dead flesh of the house to save the heart. "Where's Mrs. Gable?" he demanded. "In her rooms, Your Grace," the footman replied. "The Duchess. Her Grace manages the household now." The Duchess, of course. The pale, silent girl from the solicitor's office. The sickly commodity he had sent here to expire. A cold knot of disbelief tightened in his gut. This was her doing? It was impossible. He had left a dying woman in a dying house. He had returned to find a thriving home and, presumably, a wife who was inconveniently, impossibly alive. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I believe Her Grace is in the study, Your Grace." Alastair strode towards the study, his boots echoing on the clean stone flags. The study had been his father's domain, a place of power, filled with leather-bound books and the scent of brandy and cigars. He pushed open the door without knocking. The room was not as he remembered it. The heavy velvet curtains had been pulled back, and the afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The grand, imposing desk had been moved to sit directly in the light from the window, and behind it sat his wife. She was not the fragile, porcelain doll he remembered. Her hair was pinned up in a simple, practical knot, with a few stray strands escaping to curl at her temples. She wore a plain gray dress, its cuffs stained with a faint trace of ink. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek, as if she had been in the garden. She was bent over a large ledger, a pen in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up as he entered, her expression not of fear or surprise, but of mild annoyance at being interrupted. Her eyes, those startling, lucid gray eyes, met his. They were clear and sharp, and in their depths he saw not a flicker of the defiance he had glimpsed before, but a cool, steady, and utterly confident authority. She looked magnificent, not beautiful in the conventional sense, not a diamond of the first water to be displayed at court. She was magnificent in the way a well-honed tool is magnificent, purposeful, strong, real. He stood there in the doorway, the exhausted duke, the master of the house, feeling utterly superfluous. He had come seeking a tomb and had found a kingdom, and on the throne sat a woman he had sent here to die. A long, tense silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken history of their transaction. He was the first to break it. "You're alive," he said. The words were blunt, accusatory, stripped of all social grace. It was the only thought his exhausted brain could formulate. Alara placed her pen down with deliberate care, setting it perfectly parallel to the edge of the ledger. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. A small, dry smile touched her lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a deep and cutting irony. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she replied, her voice as cool and clear as a winter morning. The words, a perfect, chilling echo of what she had once whispered to his absent ghost, struck Alastair with the force of a physical blow. They were not an apology. They were a declaration. They told him everything he needed to know. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely and irrevocably overturned. He was no longer the master of Blackwood Manor. He was a guest, and he was not entirely sure he was a welcome one. Alastair felt a surge of raw, unreasoning anger. It was the fury of a man whose expectations had been utterly violated, whose control had been wrested from him without his knowledge or consent. He had left a pawn in this crumbling castle, and he had returned to find a queen. "What have you done to my house?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. He stepped further into the room, his large frame seeming to shrink the space, an old tactic of intimidation that felt suddenly hollow. Alara did not flinch. She gestured with one ink-stained hand to the room around them, to the sunlight, to the tidy stacks of paper on the desk. "I believe the correct term is saved it," she said calmly. "It was rotting from the inside out, much like its finances. I took the liberty of intervening before the entire structure collapsed." "You took the liberty?" he repeated, disbelief warring with fury. You boarded up half the house. You sold the family silver. I saw the tenant farms. You have turned my estate into a vegetable patch. The north and east wings were a haven for damp and a drain on our resources. We now burn half the wood and the core of the house is warm, she countered, her tone maddeningly reasonable. The silver was tarnished and useless. The money was used to purchase livestock that will feed us through the winter and seed that will ensure a harvest next year. And yes, I turned the ornamental gardens into a vegetable patch. We can eat potatoes. We cannot eat nostalgia. Each sentence was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing his outrage with cold, hard logic. He was accustomed to histrionics, to tears, to the vapid arguments of the London drawing room. He had no defense against this brutal pragmatism. He felt like a fool, storming into a general's tent to complain about the mess of battle. You had no authority, he finally managed, falling back on the one truth he felt he still possessed. At this, Alara's expression hardened. The dry irony vanished, replaced by a glacial stillness. No authority? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. You left me here to die, Your Grace. You banished me to a tomb and did not even have the courtesy to wonder if I had drawn my last breath. You abdicated your responsibility to this house, to this land, to the people who depend on it. In your absence, someone had to rule. So I did. She rose from her chair, and for the first time he realized she was not the frail, wispy thing he remembered. She was still slender, but there was a strength in her posture, a groundedness that had not been there before. She was no longer a porcelain doll. She was forged steel. This, she said, sweeping her hand to encompass the ledger, the room, the entire breathing, functioning house beyond it, is my work. I built this from the ruins you left behind. Your name may be on the deed, but this is my domain. You are the intruder here, not I. He was rendered speechless. Everything she said was true. He had abandoned this place. He had abandoned her. He had expected her to fail, to fade away. He had not anticipated this resurrection. He had not anticipated her. The silence was broken by a knock at the door. Mr. Thorne, the groundsman, entered, his cap in his hands, his face ruddy from the autumn air. He stopped short upon seeing Alistair, his eyes widening in surprise. But his attention and his loyalty was clearly directed elsewhere. Your Grace, he said, addressing Alara, begging your pardon. The last of the potato harvest is in. A better yield than we hoped. And the roofers have arrived to see to the west gable, as you ordered. Alara gave a small, approving nod. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. See that the roofers are given a hot meal before they begin, and have a crate of the best potatoes sent up to the kitchens. Sarah is making a stew for supper. Aye, Your Grace, Thorne nodded, then cast a hesitant, sideways glance at Alistair, as if noticing a piece of furniture that was out of place. He gave a short, awkward bow in the Duke's direction before retreating, closing the door softly behind him. The brief exchange was more devastating to Alistair's sense of self than any of her sharp words. The man had reported to her. He had taken his orders from her. In his own house, in front of his own face, the chain of command had been demonstrated with brutal clarity. He was irrelevant. He sank into one of the leather armchairs, the anger draining out of him, leaving behind only the profound, bone-deep weariness he had arrived with, now compounded by a dizzying sense of confusion. He had come here seeking oblivion and had instead walked into a world that was fiercely, stubbornly alive, a world that had no place for him. Alara watched him, her expression unreadable. She sat back down behind her desk, and picked up her pen. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint scratching of her pen on paper as she made a note in the ledger. She was dismissing him. The Duke of Blackwood, in his own study, was being dismissed. I will require the keys to the gun room in your father's wine cellar, she said, not looking up. Mr. Thorne believes there is a mold problem in the cellar that needs addressing, and I intend to take an inventory of the firearms. Some of them might be valuable enough to sell. He stared at her, at the absolute, unshakable confidence with which she governed her world. He felt a sudden, absurd urge to laugh. He had married a sickly, penniless orphan to be a broodmare and die quietly in the country. And he had gotten a quartermaster, a general, a queen. "The keys," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion, "are in the top drawer of my dressing table. In my rooms." She finally looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. "Which rooms would those be?" she asked, a genuine question in her voice. "We have so many that are no longer in use." The question, in its simple practicality, was the final, crushing blow. He did not even have a room in his own house anymore. The days that followed were a study in surreal displacement for Alistair. He was a ghost in his own home, a silent observer of the well-oiled machine his wife had built. He wandered the corridors of the central wing, the only part of the house that was truly alive, and felt like a foreign dignitary on a tour. The staff were polite, deferential to his title, but their energy, their purpose, all flowed from Alara. They would nod to him in the hall, then hurry on to complete a task she had set. He was the Duke, but she was the gravitational center of their universe. He found that a room had been prepared for him, his old room, in fact, but it felt different. It was clean, aired out, with a fire laid and fresh linens on the bed. But it lacked the familiar scent of neglect. It was a guest room, welcoming but impersonal. He felt no sense of ownership. He watched her from a distance, a creature of fascinating, terrifying competence. He saw her in the gardens with Mr. Thorne, her skirts hitched up, her hands in the dirt, discussing crop rotation. He saw her in the kitchens, consulting with the baker, Sarah, tasting a spoonful of broth and suggesting a pinch more time. He saw her at her desk in the study, her head bent over the ledgers, a formidable commander marshaling her forces. She moved with a purpose that he, for all his titles and political power, had not felt in years. He was fighting phantoms in Parliament. She was fighting a tangible war against winter and decay, and she was winning. A grudging, unwilling respect began to take root in the barren soil of his exhaustion. He had bought her, intending to discard her, but she had refused to be discarded. She had taken the worst place he knew, the place he had run to for its misery, and had forced it to yield life. He had tried to bury her, and she had planted a garden on her own grave. The weather turned, as it always did in the north, with a sudden, vicious swiftness. The crisp autumn days gave way to a week of relentless, driving rain and a wind that howled around the stone corners of the manor like a hungry wolf. The temperature plummeted. The world outside the windows became a churning gray misery. It was the kind of weather that had always been Blackwood's true soul, the damp chill that seeped through stone and into bone. Alistair found a strange comfort in it. This, at least, was familiar. He spent his time in the library, a bottle of his father's brandy at his elbow, listening to the storm and trying to drink himself into a state of numbness. But the house fought back. The fires burned brightly, the drafts had been tamed, and the pervasive warmth held the gnawing cold at bay. Even in this, her influence was inescapable. It was on the third day of the storm that the crisis struck. He was in the library, staring into the fire, when the door opened. It was Sarah, the young baker, her face pale with panic. "Your Grace," she stammered, wringing her hands in her apron. "It's the Duchess. She's taken ill." Alistair felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the storm. He was on his feet in an instant. What happened? She was out with Mr. Thorne this morning, seeing to the drainage in the lower field. The rain she got soaked through. She came in shivering, and now she's coughing, and she's hot, Your Grace. Terribly hot. He ran. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He burst into her rooms, the small, warm governess's suite that had been her first fortress. She was in bed, her face flushed with fever, a sheen of sweat on her brow. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and every few moments, her body was racked by a deep, ugly cough. The same cough he remembered from the solicitor's office, but 100 times worse. It was a wet, tearing sound that seemed to rip from the depths of her lungs. Mrs. Gable was there, standing by the bed with a basin of water, her usual sour expression replaced by one of genuine concern. The fever came on so fast, she said, her voice tight with worry. I've sent a boy for the doctor in the village, but with this storm, it could be hours. Alistair pushed past her, his hand going to Alara's forehead. She was burning up. Her eyes, when they flickered open, were glassy and unfocused. She murmured something. A name? Thorn, the ditch must be cleared. Even in her delirium, she was trying to run her kingdom. Alara, he said, his voice rough. He did not know he was going to use her name. It just came out. Be still. He looked at the scene, at the panicked maids, at the worried housekeeper, and a lifetime of command took over. The exhaustion, the confusion, the resentment, it all vanished, burned away by the urgent primal need to act. You, he said, pointing to a young maid. Keep the fire blazing. I want this room like a furnace. You, to another, boil water, as much as you can, and bring clean linens. Mrs. Gable, I need you to crush garlic and steep it with thyme and rosemary in the hottest water we have. We need to get her breathing the steam. They stared at him for a second, then scattered to obey. His voice, stripped of its usual weariness and imbued with the authority of a field commander, had cut through their panic. He turned back to the bed. He remembered field hospitals, the smell of sickness, and the desperate, simple remedies used to fight lung fever. He was not a doctor, but he had seen more than his share of death, and he would not let her die. Not now. Not after what she had done. He stripped off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. Give me that cloth, he ordered Mrs. Gable, taking the basin of cool water. He began to bathe Alara's face and neck, his movements gentle but efficient. Her skin was shockingly hot to the touch. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering, even as she burned with fever. It's the chill, he muttered to himself. The deep chill in the bones. The maids returned with kettles of steaming water, and Mrs. Gable brought the fragrant herbal infusion. Alistair rigged a makeshift tent over the bed with a spare sheet, trapping the steam around Alara's head. He held the bowl of steaming herbs himself, forcing the warm, pungent vapor towards her face. Breathe, Alara, he commanded, his voice low and intense. Breathe it in. For hours he worked. He became a general in a war against a single, microscopic enemy. He directed the staff, kept the fire roaring, changed the cool cloths on her head, and held the steaming bowl until his own hands were red and raw. He was dimly aware of Mrs. Gable working beside him, her earlier hostility forgotten in the face of the shared crisis. They were two soldiers in a trench, fighting for the same objective. The doctor finally arrived in the dead of night, a portly, weary man smelling of wet wool and whiskey. He examined Alara, listened to her chest, and his expression was grim. A severe inflammation of the lungs, he pronounced gravely. Her constitution is not strong. The next 12 hours will be critical. He left a bottle of laudanum for the pain and told them to continue what they were doing. Keep her warm, keep her breathing, and pray. Alistair sent the exhausted staff away, all except Mrs. Gable. He and the housekeeper kept the vigil as the storm raged outside and the fever raged within. He did not sit. He did not rest. He paced the small room, a caged tiger, stopping only to check on her, to adjust her pillows, to wipe the sweat from her brow. He saw her not as the inconvenient wife, not as the usurper of his authority, but as the architect of this small, warm world he had stumbled into. He saw the ink stains on her fingers, the smudge of dirt on her cheek. He saw the fierce, stubborn life force that had taken his rotting pile of stone and made it a home. And he was filled with a terrifying, desperate fear of losing it, of losing her. In the darkest hour before dawn, her breathing grew ragged, shallow. A terrible, rattling sound started in her chest. Mrs. Gable let out a small, choked sob. She is drowning, she whispered. Alistair felt a cold, primal terror grip him. He had seen this before on battlefields. He knew what it meant. He looked down at Alara's face, pale and still under the fever's flush, and a raw, protective fury rose in him. He would not allow it. He leaned over her, his hands on her shoulders. Alara, he said, his voice a harsh command that was also, somehow, a plea. Fight. Do you hear me? You will not surrender. You did not let this house beat you. You will not let this fever beat you. Fight. He did not know if she could hear him. Her eyes were closed, her body limp. But he felt a flicker, a faint tremor under his hands, a slight deepening of her breath. It was almost nothing, but it was there. He stayed with her, talking to her, his voice a low, constant murmur in the quiet room. He told her about the gardens, about the mended roof, about the smoke from the chimneys. He told her about the life she had breathed back into this place. He was not asking her to live for him. He was reminding her of what she had built, of what was hers to lose. He was reminding her to live for herself. As the first weak light of dawn filtered through the rain-streaked window, he felt a change. The ferocious heat of her skin began to recede, leaving behind a damp warmth. Her breathing, while still shallow, lost its terrible, rattling edge. The violent shiver subsided. The crisis had passed. The fever had broken. He sank into the chair by her bed, the strength draining out of him in a sudden, dizzying rush. He was shaking, not from cold, but from sheer emotional exhaustion. He looked at her sleeping face, the lines of strain beginning to ease. She looked fragile again, but it was the fragility of a warrior after a battle, not a victim. Mrs. Gable touched his shoulder. She will sleep now, Your Grace. A true sleep. You should rest. He shook his head, his gaze never leaving Alara. No, he said, his voice raspy. I'll stay. He sat there for hours, watching her sleep, listening to the steady, quiet rhythm of her breathing. The storm outside had passed, and the world was washed clean, hushed. In the quiet aftermath of the crisis, something profound had shifted within him. He had arrived at Blackwood seeking a grave, a place to be numb. Instead, in the heart of this small, warm room, fighting for the life of a woman he barely knew, he had found something he had not realized he was missing. A reason to fight, a reason to care. He had come here to be alone, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt terrifyingly, wonderfully not alone at all. The aftermath of the fever was a quiet, fragile truce. Alara slept for nearly a full day, a deep, healing sleep that slowly knitted her strength back together. Alistair never left the chair by her bed. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, a silent, unmoving guardian. Mrs. Gable came and went, bringing broth and tea, her movements soft, her face etched with a weary relief that mirrored his own. The animosity between them had been burned away in the crucible of the long night, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding. They had fought together for their queen. When Alara finally woke, it was late afternoon. The watery sunlight of a post-storm day filled the room, painting stripes of pale gold on the floor. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they were hazy with confusion. Then they focused on him, sitting in the chair, his clothes rumpled, his face shadowed with stubble and exhaustion. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "I'm still here," he confirmed. His own voice was rough and used. She tried to push herself up, but a wave of weakness washed over her. He was out of his chair in an instant, his hands gently pressing her back against the pillows. "Easy," he said. "The doctor said you need a rest." His touch was unexpectedly warm, his large hands careful on her shoulders. It was not a gesture of dominance, but of support, a grounding weight. She sank back, her gaze searching his face. He looked wrecked. The mask of cold, detached authority was gone, stripped away. In its place was a raw, unguarded weariness, and something else she couldn't quite name. Concern. It was concern. "The storm," she began, her mind immediately going to her duties. "The drainage ditch. Thorne is handling it." He interrupted softly. "Everything is handled. The only thing you need to worry about is getting better." He poured her a glass of water, his movements a little clumsy, and held it to her lips. She drank, the cool liquid a balm on her raw throat. The simple act of care, performed by this man who had sent her here to die, was so profoundly unexpected that it left her disoriented. Later that evening, Mrs. Gable brought in a tray with 2 bowls of Sarah's rich beef stew. She set it down on a small table between them. "You both need to eat," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. She looked from Alara's pale face to the Duke's exhausted one, and for the first time, she seemed to see them not as a mismatched, antagonistic pair, but as two people who had weathered the same storm. Alistair pulled the table closer to the bed. He handed Alara a bowl and a spoon. The silence in the room was no longer a weapon. It was a shared space, filled with the comfortable sounds of the fire crackling and the clink of spoons against pottery. "The accounts," she said suddenly, her voice stronger now. "They're a mess. I was halfway through reconciling the timber sale when—" He looked up from his stew. He did not pity her weakness. He did not dismiss her concerns. He met them. "Show me tomorrow," he said. "When you're stronger. We'll look at them together." "We." The word hung in the air between them, small but momentous. It was the first time he had included himself in the life of this house, in the world she had built. It was the first brick in a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. The next few days established a new, tentative rhythm. Alara recovered slowly, her body demanding the rest her mind fought against. Alistair became her unlikely nurse and, stranger still, her partner. In the mornings, he would sit by her bed, and she, propped up against a mountain of pillows, would direct the running of the estate. "Mr. Thorne needs to know if we should sell the older ewes at the autumn market, or try to overwinter them," she would say, her brow furrowed. And Alistair, instead of bristles at this usurping of his role, would listen. What was the hay yield? He'd ask, his mind, so adept at the grand strategy of politics, now applying itself to the practicalities of a farm. Do we have enough fodder? They would debate the merits of selling versus keeping, their voices low and focused. He found, to his astonishment, that he enjoyed it. The problems were real, tangible. The solutions had immediate, visible consequences. It was clean. It was honest work. It was a world away from the smoke and mirrors of London. He brought the ledgers to her bedside, and they spent an entire afternoon poring over them. Her handwriting was neat and precise, her notes and the margins sharp and insightful. He saw the trail of her work, the methodical way she had untangled years of neglect. "You have a remarkable head for figures," he said, the compliment sounding stiff and unused in his mouth. She glanced at him, a flicker of surprise in her gray eyes. "My father was a merchant. He believed a woman should know how to balance a book, if only to keep her husband from bankrupting her." The words had a slight edge, a reminder of their own beginnings. He did not flinch from it. "A wise man," he said quietly. As her strength returned, she began to venture from her room, leaning on his arm for support. Their first walk was down the main corridor to the study. The staff they passed watched them with wide, curious eyes. The Duke and Duchess, together, not as master and prisoner, but as a couple. They began to work side by side in the study. The large desk became a shared territory. He would sit in the armchair by the fire, reviewing tenant contracts she had drafted, while she sat at the desk, finalizing the winter stores. The silence between them was productive, companionable. He found himself telling her things, fragments of his life in London, the frustrations of his political battles. He spoke of the emptiness of his duties, the crushing weight of a title he had never wanted. "It is a different kind of prison," she commented one evening, not looking up from her work. "A gilded one, perhaps, but a prison nonetheless." He looked at her profile illuminated by the lamplight. She understood. She, who had been in a literal prison of poverty and illness, understood the cage his privilege had built around him. One afternoon, they walked out onto the terrace. The air was cold and sharp, but the sun was bright. She pointed out the different vegetables in the reclaimed garden, explaining her plans for the spring planting. He listened, fascinated by the depth of her practical knowledge. She was not just the ruler of this place. She was its heart, its brain, its driving will. She stumbled slightly on an uneven flagstone, and he reached out to steady her. His hand closed over her arm. This time, the touch lingered. It was not romantic, not passionate. It was grounding, an anchor. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and, in that quiet moment, something unspoken was acknowledged. They were survivors. They had both, in their own ways, been sent to this place to be broken. And here they were, standing in the autumn sun, scarred but whole. Partners. He had come to Blackwood seeking an end. He had found, in this pragmatic, resilient woman, a beginning. He had thought to find peace in the silence of a tomb. He was discovering it, instead, in the shared, quiet work of building a life. The hollow space inside him, the one he had tried to fill with brandy and duty, was slowly, imperceptibly, being filled with something else. The scent of wood smoke, the satisfaction of a mended roof, the quiet, steady presence of his wife. The old world arrived, as Alistair always knew it would, in the form of a royal courier. The man rode into the courtyard on a lathered horse, his uniform a slash of incongruous scarlet against the gray stone of the manor. He carried a leather dispatch case bearing the king's own seal. The sight of it sent a familiar chill down Alistair's spine, the cold dread of duty recalled. He and Alara were in the study when the footman announced the courier's arrival. Alistair saw the immediate change in her. The easy companionship they had built over the past weeks vanished in an instant. Her spine straightened, her expression became guarded, and a cool formality descended over her like a shroud. She looked at the courier, then at Alistair, and her eyes were shuttered, her thoughts hidden. She was preparing for his departure. She was rebuilding the walls he had only just begun to breach. "I will leave you to your business, your grace," she said, her voice polite and distant. She rose from the desk, already creating a space between them, already relegating him back to the role of the visiting duke whose real life was elsewhere. "Stay," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. She paused, her hand on the back of her chair, surprised. The courier, a young, officious captain, looked back and forth between them, a flicker of confusion on his face. He held out the dispatch case to Alistair. "An urgent matter from His Majesty, Your Grace. You are summoned back to London immediately. The French situation has deteriorated." Alistair took the case, but he did not open it. He looked at Alara. He saw in her eyes the certainty that he would leave. It was the logical thing to do. It was what the Duke of Blackwood had always done. His duty was to the crown, to the nation, to the endless, grinding machine of politics and power. For his entire life, that duty had been his master. He weighed the leather case in his hand. It felt impossibly heavy, filled with the demands and obligations that had hollowed him out. He thought of London, of the stale air of the House of Lords, of the endless, meaningless battles. He thought of the cold, empty townhouse that was his official residence. It was a house, not a home. He had never had a home. Then he looked around the study. He smelled the beeswax and the lingering scent of the herbs Alara had been bundling. He saw the neat stacks of account books, the tangible record of a place brought back from the brink. He saw the fire crackling in the hearth, a bastion against the coming winter. And he looked at his wife, who stood poised for flight, her face a mask of proud resignation, ready to be abandoned once more. In that moment, a profound and absolute clarity descended upon him. He knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, where his duty now lay. It was not in a distant capital, fighting for kings and countries. It was here, in this house of stone and stubborn life. It was to this land. It was to her. He turned to the courier. "There is no reply," he said, his voice calm and resolute. The captain blinked. "Your Grace? His Majesty expects you." "His Majesty," Alistair said, "will have to manage without me. My duties are here." Without taking his eyes off Alara, he walked to the fireplace. The courier and Alara watched, stunned into silence, as he unlatched the dispatch case, took out the thick vellum document with its heavy royal seal, and tossed it into the heart of the fire. The parchment blackened, curled, and then erupted into a bright, clean flame. The red wax of the royal seal melted and dripped like blood before being consumed. It was an act of treason, an act of liberation. He turned back to face her. The study was silent save for the roar of the flames devouring his old life. The courier stood frozen, his mouth agape, unable to process the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. Alistair walked towards Alara, closing the space she had tried to put between them. He stopped in front of her, so close he could see the shock and disbelief warring in her lucid gray eyes. "I've spent my entire life serving a ghost," he said, his voice low and intense, meant only for her. "A title, a legacy, a crown. I've been hollow for so long, Ilera. A caretaker for an empty house." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, the one that had been smudged with dirt weeks ago. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. "You are not a ghost," he continued, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name or contain. "This place is not empty. You took this tomb and you filled it with life. You filled it with warmth and purpose. You filled me with purpose." Her mask was crumbling, her carefully constructed defenses shattering. She was trembling, her breath catching in her throat. He looked into her eyes, laying his own soul bare. "I am not leaving," he said, the words a vow, a sacred oath sworn in the firelight. "My home is not in London. It is not in some ancestral ledger. It is here." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, and whispered the final, absolute truth. "You are my home." A sob broke from her, a sound of such profound, wrenching vulnerability that it shattered the last of his own defenses. Her hands came up to grip the front of his coat, her knuckles white, as if she were afraid he might still vanish. She was not pushing him away. She was holding on. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him. She was so slender, yet she felt as solid and real as the stone walls of the manor. She buried her face in his chest, and he held her, his hand stroking her hair, his chin resting on the top of her head. He could feel the tension draining out of her, the rigid posture she had maintained for a lifetime finally collapsing into his embrace. He was dimly aware of the courier backing out of the room, the soft click of the door sealing them inside their own world. It did not matter. Nothing outside this room, outside this house, mattered anymore. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, two solitary figures who had found their anchor in the storm. The fire crackled, the house breathed around them, a living entity that they had both, in their own ways, resurrected. The scent of burning parchment faded, replaced by the familiar, comforting smells of wood smoke and old books and home. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft, white flakes dusting the rugged land. But inside Blackwood Manor, inside the fortress they had built together, it was warm. He held her, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his. He had come here, seeking an ending, a quiet place to fade away. He had not expected to find her. He had not expected to find a life worth fighting for. He had not expected to find that the only title that truly mattered was not Duke, but husband. Ilera lifted her head, her gray eyes, washed clean by tears, luminous in the firelight. They held no more secrets, no more walls. There was only a raw, terrifying, and beautiful honesty. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Her entire being resonated with the same truth that now defined him. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a seal on a new contract, one not written on parchment, but on the shared landscape of their resilient hearts. It was a promise of shared winters and future harvests, of battles fought side by side, of a life to be built together in the house that was no longer a tomb, but a sanctuary fiercely alive and completely, finally, whole.